In the towering cliffs of Aramoor, a moment of reckoning is about to unfold. Princess Thalenne had built her kingdom on one rule: never let outsiders breach her walls. Her wealth could save thousands, but her heart remained locked away like her gold. Then came the storm that changed everything. 3 giant knights from the northern ice tribes collapsed at her gates, their massive frames broken and bleeding. These weren't common soldiers. They were legends, warriors whose names were whispered in both fear and reverence across the frozen lands. As they knelt before her throne, the largest warrior spoke words that would shatter her cold resolve. "Please don't turn us away like the others." What Thalenne discovered next would force her to choose between the safety of her selfish isolation and a truth about her mother's past that could reshape her entire kingdom. Would a princess known for her cruelty finally learn the true cost of compassion? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ivory throne of Aramoor had been carved from the bones of ancient whales, bleached white by centuries of salt wind and royal indifference. Princess Thalenne sat upon it now, her silk gown the color of fresh snow, her eyes the pale blue of winter ice. Around her, the great hall stretched in magnificent emptiness, its vaulted ceilings lost in shadows that no amount of wealth could illuminate. She was 28 years old and had never known want. The kingdom of Aramoor perched on sea cliffs so high that clouds often obscured the lands below, and Thalenne had long ago stopped looking down. Her father, King Aldrich, had died 3 winters past, leaving her a realm built on a simple principle: keep the world at bay, and the world cannot hurt you. "Your Highness," came the voice of Chief Advisor Goran, his thin frame appearing from behind a marble pillar. He was a man of 60 winters, with silver hair combed back severely and eyes that calculated the cost of everything, including kindness. "The morning reports." Thalenne nodded without interest. The reports were always the same. Trade flourished because Aramoor demanded high prices for its mountain wool and cliffside silver. The treasury grew because no gold ever left the kingdom in charity or aid. The people lived well because they never shared their prosperity with outsiders. 17 ships turned away at the harbor this week, Goran continued, reading from a Kamasinv scroll, mostly refugees from the Eastern Wars. The harbor master reports they pleaded for food and shelter, but our laws were upheld. "Good," Thalenne said, her voice carrying no more warmth than the marble beneath her feet. "What of the northern borders?" "Quiet, Your Highness. The ice tribes continue their feuds among themselves. No concern of ours." Captain Marduk entered the hall, his boots echoing against the stone. He was a bear of a man with graying hair and scars that spoke of battles fought far from these comfortable walls. Unlike Goran, who had been born to serve in palaces, Marduk had known the weight of a sword before he knew the weight of responsibility. "Your Highness," he said, offering a slight bow. "The morning patrol reports nothing unusual. The gates remain secure." Those gates. Thalenne had seen them only from above. Massive iron barriers that had not opened for strangers in her lifetime. They were her father's greatest achievement, he had often said. No beggars, no desperate merchants, no political refugees seeking sanctuary. Aramoor remained pure, untainted by the chaos that consumed other kingdoms. "Tell me, Captain," she said, studying his weathered face, "do you ever wonder about those we turn away?" Marduk's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. "It is not my place to wonder, Your Highness. My duty is to protect this kingdom, and you do it well." She rose from the throne, her gown rustling like autumn leaves. "Walk with me." They moved through corridors lined with tapestries depicting Aramoor's history. Every image showed the kingdom standing alone. Victorious battles where they fought only for themselves. Trade negotiations where they gave nothing away. Royal ceremonies attended only by their own nobles. It was a proud history, Thalenne had been taught a smart history. Her chambers occupied the highest tower, windows facing north toward the frozen lands where barbarian tribes fought endless wars. She had often stood at these windows as a child, watching distant smoke signals and wondering what stories they told. Her mother, Queen Isabel, would find her there and spin tales of honor and sacrifice, of heroes who helped strangers and kingdoms that opened their doors to those in need. Fairy tales, her father had called them after her mother's death. Pretty stories that get good people killed. Now, alone in her chambers, Thalenne touched the cold glass and remembered. Her mother had been different. Softer, perhaps, but not weak. She had possessed a strength that came from caring, not from closing oneself off from the world. A servant entered carrying the evening meal on a silver tray. The girl was young, perhaps 16, with the rough hands of someone born to labor. She set the tray down carefully, her eyes never meeting the princess's. "What is your name?" Thalenne asked. The girl startled. Princesses did not typically speak to servants. "Myra, your highness. Do you have family, Myra?" "Yes, your highness. My parents work in the lower city. My brother serves in the guard." "And if they were hungry, what would you do?" The question seemed to confuse the girl. I would share my food with them, your highness. Even if sharing meant you went hungry yourself?" "Of course, your highness. They are my family." After the girl left, Thalenne sat alone with her meal-roasted fowl with honey glaze, bread still warm from the ovens, wine from grapes that grew nowhere else in the world. Enough food to feed a family for days, served to one person who ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The storm began at sunset, as autumn storms often did along the cliffs. Rain lashed the windows with increasing fury, and the wind howled through the stone corridors like the voices of the lost. Thalenne had always loved storms. They made the castle feel even more separate from the world, even more secure in its isolation. She was preparing for bed when the commotion began. Shouts echoed from the courtyard below, followed by the heavy footsteps of guards running through corridors. Wrapping a cloak around her shoulders, she made her way to the great hall, where she found Chaos. Chief Advisor Goran stood near the throne, his usually perfect composure cracked. Captain Marduk was shouting orders to guards who seemed uncertain how to follow them. And at the center of it all, impossible to ignore or dismiss, knelt three figures that should not exist. They were giants. Not metaphorically, but literally men so large they had to kneel to fit beneath the hall's high arches. Even on their knees, they towered over the guards surrounding them. Their armor was unlike anything Thalenne had ever seen. Plates of what looked like ice that somehow never melted, inscribed with runes that seemed to shift in the torchlight. Blood pooled beneath them. Deep wounds marked their arms and faces, and one giant's left shoulder hung at an unnatural angle. They had fought recently, and fought hard, but they had not come here to fight. Their weapons lay abandoned at the hall's entrance, a gesture of surrender or perhaps respect. The largest of the three, a man with hair the color of fresh snow and eyes like winter sky, looked up as Thalenne entered. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of mountains and the weariness of ages. "Princess Thalenne of Aramoor," he said, each word carefully chosen. "I am Thorvin of the Ice Tribes, son of Jarl Eriksson, keeper of the Northern Watch. With me are my sworn brothers, Gunnar the Bold and Magnus the Wise. We have traveled far through storm and battle to reach your gates." The hall fell silent, except for the rain drumming against stone. Thalenne felt every eye upon her, waiting for her response. This was the moment her father had prepared her for, the test of her resolve against the weakness of mercy. "You are not welcome here," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Aramoor does not harbor strangers." "We know your laws," Thorvin replied. "We know your reputation. But desperate times call for desperate measures." He paused, and when he continued, His voice held a note that made something deep in Thalenne's chest constrict. Please don't turn us away like the others. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything she had been taught, everything she believed. Behind her, she could feel Garen's disapproval radiating like heat from a forge. Around her, guards waited for orders that would determine not just the fate of these three giants, but perhaps the fate of her kingdom. And in that moment, staring into eyes that held depths she had never allowed herself to explore, Princess Thalenne felt the first crack in the ice around her heart. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Thorvin's massive sword lay where he had placed it upon entering, a blade unlike any forged in the southern kingdoms. The metal appeared to be ice, yet it held an edge sharper than the finest steel. Runes ran along its fuller, glowing faintly with an inner light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. "Your Highness," Garen whispered urgently at her shoulder. "The law is clear. No exceptions." Thalenne studied the three giants. Up close, their wounds were even more severe than she had first realized. Dark blood seeped through gaps in their ice-forged armor, and Gunnar the Bold swayed slightly where he knelt, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. "How did you reach our gates?" she asked, surprised by her own question. She should have ordered their removal immediately. Magnus the Wise, his beard white as winter morning, spoke for the first time. His voice carried the rasp of someone who had shouted commands through countless battles. "We climbed the cliffs in the storm, Princess. The harbor master would not permit us to dock." "Wise of him," Captain Marduk muttered, though his eyes remained fixed on the giant's weapons with professional interest. "You climbed?" Thalenne's voice betrayed her disbelief. The cliffs of Aramoor rose 300 feet from the churning sea below. In a storm, the feat was not just dangerous, it should have been impossible. "Our need was great," Thorvin said simply, "and our time grows short. What need could drive ice barbarians to such desperation?" Goran demanded, his thin voice sharp with suspicion. For the first time, anger flashed in Thorvin's winter-blue eyes. "We are not barbarians, Southern man. We are the last guardians of the Northern Watch, and we have held back the darkness while your soft kingdoms counted their gold." "Darkness?" The word came from Thalenne before she could stop it. Something about the way he spoke it with such weight, such certainty, made her skin prickle with unease. Thorvin turned his gaze back to her, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Fear. Not for himself, but the deep bone cold terror of someone who had seen something that should not exist. "Princess," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I know your laws. I know your kingdom has thrived by turning away from the troubles of others. But what comes from the North will not respect your walls or your isolation. The ancient evil stirs. The ice screams with it. And we," he gestured to his wounded companions, "we are all that stands between that darkness and every kingdom in the south." "Lies," Goran spat. "Northern savages seeking shelter through fear-mongering." "What?" Thalenne barely heard him. Something in Thorvin's words had awakened a memory, faint but persistent. Her mother's voice, soft in the darkness of her childhood chambers. "The ice remembers, little star. It remembers when the world was young, and the darkness was held at bay by heroes who asked for nothing in return." "Your Highness," Captain Marduk said carefully, "perhaps we should hear what they have to say. If there is truly a threat—" "There is no threat that concerns Aramoor," Goran interrupted. "We have walls. We have the sea. We have distance from whatever petty wars consume the frozen wastes." Thorvin struggled to his feet, and even wounded, his presence filled the hall. "Distance will not save you. Walls will not hold it. The darkness I speak of consumed the eternal glacier in 3 days. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years simply vanished. Their people, their histories, their very stones gone as if they had never been." The giant's words rang with such conviction that even Goran fell silent. Around them, guards shifted uneasily, hands moving unconsciously to their sword hilts. "Even if this were true," Thalenne said slowly, "what would you have us do? Aramoor is not a military power. We are merchants and craftsmen." "You are more than you know," Magnus said, his ancient eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. "Your mother understood this." The words hit Thalenne like a physical blow. "What did?" "You say?" "Queen Isabel," Thorvin said gently. "She was known to us, respected among our people." "Impossible." The word came out harsher than Thalenne intended. "My mother never left this kingdom. She never dealt with outsiders." The three giants exchanged glances. Dunar, who had remained silent through pain and blood loss, finally spoke. His voice was weak but clear. "The golden-haired queen who came to us in the worst winter in memory, who brought healing supplies when our children were dying of the red fever, who asked for nothing in return but our promise to remember." The great hall seemed to spin around Thalenne. Her mother had been dead for 8 years, but she remembered that golden hair, those gentle hands that had soothed away childhood fears and nightmares. "When?" she whispered. 15 winters passed," Thorvin replied. "I was barely more than a boy, but I remember her face. Her kindness. She saved my sister's life. 15 years ago. Thalenne would have been 13, old enough to notice if her mother had left the kingdom. But there had been a time she remembered now when her mother had taken a long retreat to the northern tower, claiming she needed solitude for prayer and reflection. 2 weeks of absence that no one questioned because Queen Isabel was beloved and trusted. "You lie," Goran said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "We do not lie about debts of honor," Magnus said with quiet dignity. "Your mother asked nothing of us then, but she made us swear an oath. If ever her daughter faced true peril, if ever Aramoor stood in need, we would come. We would offer what aid we could." The implications crashed over Thalenne like the storm winds outside. Her mother, her gentle, storytelling mother, had not just known of the outside world. She had actively helped strangers, had built relationships with people her own kingdom would have turned away without a second thought. "Why now?" she managed to ask. "Why come to me?" "Because the darkness spreads faster than we hoped," Thorvin said. "Because 5 kingdoms have already fallen to it. Because we are the last of our people still standing, and we need allies." He paused, studying her face. "And because your mother believed that when the time came, her daughter would have the courage to do what was right. The weight of expectation, of legacy she had never known she carried, pressed down on Thalenne's shoulders." Around her, the court waited. Goran's disapproval was palpable. Captain Marduk watched with guarded curiosity. The servants who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event whispered among themselves and in the center of it all, 3 wounded giants who claimed her mother had been a secret hero, who spoke of ancient evils and gathering darkness, who asked nothing more than shelter and the chance to heal before continuing a fight that might save or damn them all. "One night," she heard herself say. "You may stay 1 night while I consider your words." Goran's sharp intake of breath echoed through the hall. "Your Highness, I must protest." "1 night?" Thalenne repeated, her voice gaining strength. "Captain Marduk, see that they are given quarters in the eastern tower. Food and water. Have the physician tend their wounds." "Your Highness," Thorvin said, inclining his massive head. "You honor us." As the giants were led away, their footsteps echoing like distant thunder, Thalenne remained standing before her throne. She had just broken the most fundamental law of her kingdom. She had shown mercy to strangers. She had, for the first time in her life, chosen to trust rather than turn away. And as she watched the eastern tower's windows begin to glow with lamplight, she wondered if her mother would have been proud or horrified by what she had just done. Sleep eluded Princess Thalenne that night. She paced her chambers as the storm raged outside. her mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. Every few minutes, she found herself at the northern window, staring toward the tower where the giants rested. Dawn brought no peace. Only gray skies and the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Thalenne dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue silk, her mother's favorite color, and made her way to the small chapel where Queen Isabel's tomb lay in marble splendor. The chapel was empty at this early hour, lit only by candles that flickered. In their alcoves, Thalenne knelt before the tomb, studying the carved likeness of her mother's face. The artist had captured her gentle smile, the wisdom in her eyes, but had he captured the secrets as well? "Mother," she whispered to the stone, "what did you do? Why did you know that you never told me?" The marble offered no answers, but memories began to surface. Her mother returning from those mysterious retreats with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with prayer. The way she had insisted on personally overseeing the kingdom's food stores, always ordering more than seemed necessary. How she had questioned the servants about their families, their needs, their struggles in a way that went beyond polite interest. "Your Highness?" The voice belonged to Myra, the young servant from the previous evening. She stood in the chapel doorway, uncertain whether to enter. "Come," Thalenne said, rising from her knees. "Walk with me." They moved through corridors that were beginning to stir with the day's activities. Servants hurried past with breakfast trays and fresh linens. Guards changed shifts with quiet efficiency. The castle was waking up, but Thalenne felt as though she was still caught in a dream. "Tell me about your family, Myra," she said as they walked. The girl glanced around nervously. "Your Highness, your parents, your brother in the guard. What are their lives like?" Myra's confusion was evident, but she answered, "My father works in the harbor, Your Highness, loading and unloading merchant ships. My mother takes in washing for the wealthy merchants' wives. My brother Eric serves in the Western garrison. And are they happy?" The question seemed to catch Myra off guard. "Happy, Your Highness? I suppose they are content. We have food and shelter. More than many." "More than many where?" "In other kingdoms, Your Highness. The refugees who come to our harbors, they tell stories of hunger, of war, of children who sleep in the cold." Myra's voice dropped. "My brother says the harbor guards have orders to turn them all away, no matter their need." Thalenne stopped, walking. "What do you think of those orders?" The girl's eyes widened with fear. "It is not my place to think, Your Highness. But if it were—" Myra was quiet for a long moment, struggling with the unprecedented request for her opinion. Finally, she spoke so softly that Thalenne had to lean closer to hear. "Sometimes I dream about the children, Your Highness. The ones my brother describes. I wonder if they have mothers who sing to them, who worry about them. I wonder what I would do if I were them, and someone like us turned me away." The honesty in the girl's voice struck Thalenne like a blade. She had never considered the human faces behind the statistics Gorn reported each week. 17 ships turned away. How many people was that? How many children? They had reached the eastern tower, where the giants rested. 2 guards stood at attention outside the door, but they stepped aside as Thalenne approached. "How are our guests?" she asked. "Healing, Your Highness," one guard replied. "The physician says their wounds are severe, but not life-threatening. They've been quiet, no trouble." Thalenne nodded and entered the tower chambers. The room had been hastily prepared for such large occupants, extra bedding. Furniture moved to accommodate their size. The 3 giants sat around a simple wooden table, sharing a breakfast that looked meager compared to their massive frames. "Princess," Thorvin said, rising carefully. His left arm was bound in fresh bandages, but his movements seemed easier than the night before. "Please, sit. How do you fare this morning?" "Better, thanks to your kindness," Magnus replied. His color had improved. Though his eyes still held the weight of exhaustion, Gunnar remained quiet, his shoulder immobilized but his breathing steady. When he caught Thalenne's gaze, he offered a small nod of gratitude. "You spoke last night of my mother," Thalenne said, settling into a chair that the servants had brought. "Tell me more." Thorvin exchanged glances with his companions before speaking. "The winter of the red fever was the worst in our clan's memory. Our children were dying. Our children were dying. Faster than we could build pyres for them. Our healers had no remedy, no hope to offer grieving parents. Then she came," Magnus continued, "through blizzards that would have killed lesser people. She brought medicines, blankets, knowledge of how to treat the sickness. She stayed for 6 days, working alongside our healers until the fever broke. Why?" The question burst from Thalenne before she could stop it. Why would she risk so much for strangers? "We asked her the same thing," Thorvin said with a sad smile. "She said she had been blessed with abundance. An abundance that is not shared becomes a burden on the soul." The words resonated with something deep in Thalenne's memory. Her mother had said something similar once during one of their evening talks. Wealth that serves only itself is the poorest treasure of all. "She made us promise," Gunnar said, speaking for the first time that morning. His voice was hoarse but determined. "Promise that if ever her daughter needed allies, if ever Aramoor faced true peril, we would remember her kindness." "And you have remembered," Thalenne said. "We have done more." "Then remember," Magnus said quietly. "We have watched. From a distance, always from a distance, but we have watched over this kingdom as she asked." A chill ran down Thalenne's spine. "Watched how?" "Trade ships that threatened to blockade your ports found themselves storm-damaged before they could act," Thorvin explained. "Pirates who eyed your merchant vessels discovered their ships sinking mysteriously in the night. Raiders who planned to test your defenses found their camps destroyed by avalanches. The implications were staggering. For years, Aramoor had believed its isolation and wealth made it safe from external threats. But these giants suggested they had been protected by guardians they never knew existed." "Why tell me this now?" she asked. "Because the darkness that comes from the north will not be turned aside by storms or avalanches," Magnus said gravely. "Because it devours everything in its path: stone, steel, flesh, and soul. Because we can no longer protect you from a distance." Thalenne sat in silence, absorbing the weight of revelation. Her mother had not been the gentle dreamer she remembered, but a woman of action who had forged secret alliances and inspired loyalty across vast distances. The kingdom's safety had not been built on isolation alone, but on bonds of honor and debt that Thalenne had never suspected. "What would you ask of me?" she finally said. "Sanctuary while we heal," Thorvin replied. "Time to gather what allies remain. Permission to send word to our scattered kinsmen that Aramoor stands with the light. And if I refuse, then we will leave as we came, and pray that your walls prove stronger than those of the 5 kingdoms that have already fallen." The weight of decision pressed down on Thalenne like the stone of the castle itself. Everything she had been taught, every law she had been raised to uphold, argued against what these giants asked. But her mother's hidden legacy, the revelation of protection she had never earned, and the growing certainty that isolation was not the same as safety, all of these pulled her toward a choice that would change everything. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Time is what we have least of," Magnus warned gently. "Each day the darkness grows stronger. Each day more fleets advance, only to find closed doors and turned backs." As Thalenne left the tower, her mind raced with questions and possibilities. In her chambers, she found something that made her stop in her tracks, a small golden locket on her dressing table, one she had never seen before. Inside was a miniature painting of a woman with golden hair and kind eyes, but it was not her. "Mother." Beneath the painting was an inscription in her mother's hand: "For those who cannot speak for themselves." How many secrets had her mother kept? How many people had she helped in silence while her daughter learned to close her heart to the world's needs? Thalenne clutched the locket and realized that her choice was not just about 3 wounded giants or an ancient evil from the north. It was about who she wanted to be, her father's daughter, safe behind walls of gold and indifference, or her mother's child, willing to risk everything for honor and hope. The hidden chambers lay behind a false wall in her mother's former study, revealed when Thalenne pressed the small ruby that formed the eye of a carved dove in the bookshelf. The mechanism was so well concealed that she never would have found it without the cryptic note tucked inside the locket. Where the dove watches, truth waits. What she discovered in those chambers shattered every assumption about the mother. She thought she knew. Ledgers filled with meticulous records stretched back 15 years. Not the official treasury books that Goran maintained, but private accounts in her mother's careful script. Food distributed to refugee ships in the harbors. Shadow. Medical supplies sent north to the ice tribes. Gold quietly transferred to support orphanages in war-torn kingdoms. The numbers were staggering, not just in their quantity, but in their consistency. Week after week, month after month, year after year, Queen Isabel had siphoned resources from the royal treasury to help those in need. Impossible, Thalenne whispered, sinking into her mother's chair. The ledgers showed that nearly a quarter of Aramoor's wealth had been secretly redistributed during her mother's lifetime. Yet the kingdom had continued to prosper, had even grown richer. How? The answer lay in a separate journal, one that documented a network of grateful allies her mother had cultivated. Merchants who offered favorable trade agreements in memory of aid received during desperate times. Ship captains who warned of storms and pirates because Aramoor had sheltered their families. Kingdoms that shared intelligence about threats because Queen Isabel had shared their burdens. Her mother had not just given away wealth, she had invested it in goodwill that returned tenfold. Your Highness? Captain Mardek's voice came from the study's main chamber. Forgive the intrusion, but you've been here for hours. The court grows concerned. Thalenne emerged from the hidden chambers, the ledgers clutched in her arms. Captain, how long have you served this kingdom? 23 years, Your Highness, since before your birth. And my mother? What did you think of her? Mardek's scarred face softened. Queen Isabel was the finest woman I ever knew. Gentle but strong, wise but kind. Your father was fortunate to have her counsel. Did you know about her charitable work? The captain's expression grew careful. I knew she had a generous heart, Your Highness. That's not what I asked. Mardek was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Finally, he sighed. I knew. Not the details, but I knew she sometimes sent supplies beyond our borders. I helped arrange some of the transports. Why didn't you tell me? Because she asked me not to. And because after she died, your father made it clear that such activities would not continue under his rule. Thalenne felt another piece of her understanding shift. My father knew? He knew and forbade it. Called it dangerous foolishness that would drain the treasury and invite invasion. Mardek's voice held a note of old sadness. They argued about it often in those last months before her death. The admission hung in the air between them. Thalenne had memories of her parents' hushed conversations that stopped when she entered. Rooms of a growing distance between them that she had attributed to the pressures of rule. Now she understood had been a fundamental disagreement about what it meant to be a good ruler. The giant spoke truth about her, she said, more to herself than to Mardek. Every word. I was there when she returned from the northern journey. I saw the exhaustion in her face, but also the satisfaction. She had saved lives, Your Highness. Dozens of them. A commotion in the corridor interrupted their conversation. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, and then Goran burst into the study. Without ceremony. Your Highness, we have a problem. Word has spread about our guests. The Merchants' Council demands an immediate audience. Thalenne set the ledgers aside carefully. What word has spread? That you harbor northern savages. That you've broken the founding laws of our kingdom. They're threatening to withdraw support if you don't expel the giants immediately. Let them come, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The great hall filled quickly with Aramoor's most powerful citizens, merchants who controlled the trade routes, nobles who owned vast estates in the fertile valleys below the cliffs, guild masters whose crafts brought wealth from across the sea. They gathered in expensive silks and jeweled chains, their faces showing various degrees of anger and concern. Merchant Lord Alduin, a man whose ships carried Aramoor's goods to distant ports, spoke first. Your Highness, we understand you've allowed foreign warriors into our kingdom. This cannot stand. Why? Thalenne asked from her throne. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Because it violates our most sacred laws. Our prosperity depends on neutrality, on isolation from foreign conflicts. Our prosperity, she repeated slowly. Tell me, Lord Alduin, when your ships sail to foreign ports, do you trade only with the wealthy? I trade with those who can pay, naturally. And those who cannot pay? The poor, the desperate, those fleeing war or disaster. What becomes of them? Alduin frowned. That is not my concern, Your Highness. I am a merchant, not a charity. Around the hall, murmurs of agreement rose from the assembled nobles. These were practical people who understood the world in terms of profit and loss, supply and demand. Compassion was a luxury they believed Aramoor could not afford. What if I told you, Thalenne said, rising from her throne, that our prosperity has always depended on more than isolation? That for 15 years, this kingdom has been protected by allies we earned through generosity, not walls we built through selfishness? She gestured to Captain Marduk, who stepped forward with visible reluctance. Captain, tell them about the Blackwater pirates who planned to raid our shipping lanes 3 years ago. Marduk's voice was steady but uncomfortable. Their ship sank in a storm before they could attack, all hands lost. And the Valish fleet that threatened our harbor 5 years ago? Scattered by an unexpected squall, never reached our waters. Convenient weather, Thalenne said, her voice carrying a new authority. Or perhaps intervention by allies who remembered past kindness. The hall had grown very quiet. Even Gorin, standing near the throne, seemed uncertain how to respond. Your Highness, Lord Alduin said carefully, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that my mother, Queen Isabel, understood something that we have forgotten. That wealth hoarded becomes stagnant, but wealth shared creates bonds stronger than any wall. She walked among them as she spoke, meeting their eyes. One by one, the giants who rest in our tower are not conquerors or thieves. They are the last guardians of the Northern Watch, fleeing from a darkness that has already consumed 5 kingdoms. They came here because my mother once saved their children from plague, asking nothing in return but the promise that they would remember. Even if that's true, another merchant called out, what would you have us do? Open our gates to every refugee and beggar? Empty our treasury for strangers' needs? I would have us do what my mother did, Thalenne replied. I would have us invest in hope instead of hoarding gold out of fear. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Young Mira stepped forward from where she had been standing with the other servants, her face pale but determined. Your Highness, she said, her voice trembling but clear. My brother Eric serves in the harbor guard. He has told me things about the ships we turn away, about the children who cry for food while we feast in plenty. She looked around at the assembled nobles, her courage growing with each word. He says it haunts him, turning away mothers with sick babies, old men who can barely stand. He says sometimes he wonders what kind of people we've become. Lord Alduin's face flushed with anger. How dare a servant speak in the presence of— Let her speak, Thalenne commanded, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. Mira swallowed hard but continued. My family has served this castle for 3 generations. We've been loyal, grateful for the security and comfort Aramoor provides. But loyalty should flow both ways, shouldn't it? If we expect the giants to be grateful for one night's shelter, shouldn't we be grateful to those who have protected us for years without our knowledge? The wisdom in the girl's words struck the hall like lightning. Here was a servant showing more understanding of honor and debt than the kingdom's wealthiest citizens. The girl speaks sense, came a gruff voice from the back of the hall. Captain Marduk stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt. I've served this kingdom in war and peace. I've seen what happens to nations that trust only in their own strength. He looked directly at the assembled merchants. I've also seen what happens to those who honor their debts and protect their allies. The first fall to their enemies, the second endure. A murmur ran through the crowd, but not all of it was supportive. Several nobles exchanged glances that spoke of plans forming, of opposition organizing. Goran, who had remained silent through the exchange, finally spoke. Your Highness, even if we accept that your mother had arrangements with foreign elements, that doesn't obligate us to continue them. The kingdom has prospered under the current policies. Why risk what we have built? Because what we have built may not be enough, Thalenne replied. She thought of the giant's words about kingdoms that had fallen, of darkness that consumed stone and flesh alike. The world is changing, Lord Goran. We can change with it, or we can cling to old ways, until they drag us down. She moved to stand before her mother's portrait, which hung beside the throne. The painted eyes seemed to watch her with approval and encouragement. I propose a new path, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Not the abandonment of our prosperity, but its expansion. Not the destruction of our security, but its strengthening through alliance rather than isolation. And if this path fails? Lord Aldwin demanded. If your generosity bankrupts us or invites invasion, then we will have failed while trying to. Be worthy of the prosperity we've been given, Thalenne replied. I would rather fall while helping others than survive while turning my back on those in need. The debate that followed was fierce but brief. The merchants and nobles were not evil people, merely frightened ones who had grown comfortable with their certainties. But certainty, Thalenne was learning, was often the enemy of growth. In the end, she made a decision that would have been unthinkable the day before. The giants will remain as our guests until they are healed. We will listen to their counsel about the threat from the north, and we will begin to explore what it means to be a kingdom that serves more than its own interests. The grumbling was immediate and vocal, but no one challenged her directly. They were merchants and nobles, not revolutionaries. They would complain, they would scheme, they would seek ways to protect their own interests, but they would not openly rebel against a decision made from the throne. As the hall emptied, Thalenne found herself alone with Captain Marduk and the young servant Mira. The girl looked terrified by her own boldness, but also oddly proud. Thank you, Thalenne said to her. Your words carried more wisdom than many who have spoken from this throne. Mira curtsied deeply. I only spoke what my heart told me was true, Your Highness. After the girl left, Marduk approached the throne. You know this won't be easy, he said quietly. Change never is, especially when it challenges people's sense of safety. I know. Thalenne looked up at her mother's portrait again. But I'm beginning to understand that true safety doesn't come from walls alone. It comes from the bonds we forge with others, the trust we build through our actions. She thought of the ledgers hidden in her mother's chambers, of years of secret generosity that had created a network of allies and protectors. Her mother had understood something that her father, for all his political wisdom, had missed, that isolation was not strength, but brittleness. And that kindness was not weakness, but the foundation of true power. The choice was made, but Thalenne knew it was only the beginning. The real test would come when the comfortable certainties of the past gave way to the uncertain possibilities of the future. She only hoped she had the courage to see it through, and that her mother's legacy would be strong enough to guide her on the path she had chosen to walk. 3 days passed before the ancient map was unfurled in Thalenne's private chambers. Magnus the Wise had insisted on being present despite his wounds, claiming that the parchment was too dangerous to trust to words alone. When Thorvin carefully spread it across the large oak table, Thalenne understood why. The map was unlike anything in Aramoor's archives. Instead of the familiar coastlines and mountain ranges she knew, it showed the world as it truly was, a vast expanse where her kingdom occupied merely a small corner of something immense and terrible. The northern regions, where she had always imagined endless ice and scattered barbarian tribes, revealed themselves as a complex network of ancient cities, sacred sites, and fortifications that stretched beyond the edge of the parchment, and spreading across it all, like spilled ink consuming everything it touched, was the darkness. The eternal glacier was here, Magnus said, pointing to what appeared to be a great white expanse in the far north. His finger traced along markings that seemed to pulse with their own faint light. 10,000 years it stood, holding back what should never have woken. 3 days it took for that ancient ice to turn black and melt into nothing. Thalenne studied the symbols scattered across the map. Some she recognized from her education cities and kingdoms that appeared in the southern trade records. Others were completely foreign, marked with runes that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. These places, she said, indicating several symbols that had been crossed out with what looked like dried blood. The 5 kingdoms you mentioned? Gone, Thorvin confirmed grimly. Valdris fell first, a mountain fortress that had never been taken in 7 centuries of war. The darkness simply flowed over its walls like water, and by morning there was nothing left but bare stone. Gunnar, his arm still bound but his strength returning, pointed to another marked location. Ironhaven. Lasted longer. They had warning. Time to prepare. Their armies numbered in the thousands. Their walls were reinforced with the finest steel. It made no difference. What exactly is this darkness? Thalenne asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. The 3 giants exchanged glances. Finally, Magnus spoke, his ancient voice heavy with knowledge that hurt to carry. We call it the void that hungers. Your southern scholars might term it an ancient evil, but that's too simple. It's older than kingdoms, older than the races of men. It existed before the world took its current shape, and it has always sought to return that world to the emptiness it remembers. It doesn't just destroy, Thorvin added. It unmakes. Towns, people, memories, everything that ever was in the places it touches simply ceases to exist. Not dead, not ruined. Gone, as if they had never been. Thalenne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the tower windows. And it's moving south? Faster each day. Magnus pointed to markings on the map that seemed to creep closer to familiar territories. At its current pace, it will reach the civilized lands within a month, maybe less. The implications were staggering. Every kingdom south of the ice lands, including Aramoor, was in the path of something that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons, or stopped by conventional defenses. The isolation that had protected her people for generations would mean nothing against a force that consumed existence itself. Why hasn't word of this reached us? She asked. Surely the southern kingdoms know? They know, Gunnar said bitterly. We carried warnings to 17 different rulers. Showed them maps, shared eyewitness accounts, offered to fight alongside their armies. Do you know what we found? Thalenne shook her head, though she was beginning to suspect. Close gates, Thorvin said. turned backs. Fear disguised as skepticism. Every ruler had the same response. This was a northern problem, not their concern. They would protect their own borders and let the ice tribes deal with their own troubles. The words hit Thalenne like physical blows. How many times had she heard similar sentiments in her own court? How many crises had Aramoor dismissed as someone else's responsibility? "But you kept trying," she said. "Because your mother made us swear an oath," Magnus replied. "Not just to protect Aramoor, but to warn the southern kingdoms when the time came. We have fulfilled that oath 17 times over, and you are the first ruler to even listen." Thalenne moved to the window, staring out at the peaceful kingdom spread below her tower. Smoke rose from countless chimneys. Children played in the cobblestone streets. Merchants hawked their wares in the market squares. All of it might vanish within weeks, not just destroyed, but completely erased from existence. What can be done? She asked without turning around. Alone? Nothing, Thorvin admitted. The void feeds on isolation, on the gaps between people and nations. It consumes what stands alone and grows stronger with each victory. But together? Thalenne turned back to face them. Together, there might be hope, Magnus said. The ancient texts speak of the first alliance, a joining of all free peoples against the darkness when it last stirred. They built the eternal glacier as a prison, bound the void with chains of shared will and sacrifice. How? We don't know, Gunnar said simply. The knowledge was lost when the ice tribe split into warring clans. But we know it required representatives from every kingdom, every people, working in perfect unity. The enormity of what they suggested began to dawn on Thalenne. You're talking about uniting not just the northern tribes, but every kingdom from here to the eastern seas. Nations that have been enemies for generations. Yes, Thorvin said. Impossible, most would say. But your mother believed it could be done. She spoke of a day when necessity would force old enemies to become new allies. And you think that day has come? That day is here, Magnus said with absolute certainty. The question is whether the southern kingdoms will recognize it before. It's too late. Thalenne returned to the map, studying the marked locations more carefully. Some were allies of Aramoor, trading partners who might listen to reason. Others were rivals, kingdoms that had competed with her people for resources and influence. A few were outright enemies, nations that would view any approach from Aramoor with suspicion. If I were to try, she said slowly, where would I begin? With those closest to the danger, Thorvin suggested. The mountain kingdoms to the east have already seen refugees fleeing south. They know something terrible is happening, even if they don't understand what. And after that? The coastal nations. They have the ships needed to evacuate populations if the worst happens. The island kingdoms might serve as refuges if the mainland falls. Thalenne was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what they were discussing. She was a princess who had never left her own kingdom, had never dealt with foreign diplomats except through intermediaries. The idea of personally leading a diplomatic mission to unite fractious nations against an ancient evil seemed absurd. Yet the alternative was to wait behind her walls while the world ended around her. There's something else, Magnus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He reached into his traveling pack and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, Thalenne saw a medallion unlike anything in Aramoor's treasury. The disc was made of metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. In its center was a single drop of what appeared to be frozen blood, dark red and perfectly preserved. What is it? She asked, though she made no move to touch the thing. A blood oath medallion, Thorvin explained. The most sacred bond known to the ice tribes. It was given to your mother after she saved our people from the red fever. I don't understand. When Queen Isabel tended our sick, Magnus said, She contracted the fever herself. For 3 days, she burned with it while continuing to work. On the 4th day, the fever broke, but not before her blood mingled with that of our clan leader's daughter, whom she had saved. Gunnar continued the story. In our tradition, shared blood in the face of death creates a bond that transcends death itself. Your mother became, in every way that matters, a member of our clan, and that bond passes to her children. The medallion seemed to pulse in the lamplight, and Thalenne felt a strange pull toward it, as if it recognized something in her blood. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means," Thorvald said solemnly, "that you are not just a princess of Aramoor, seeking aid from foreign allies. You are clan sister to the Ice Tribes, bound by blood and honor to stand with us against the darkness." As the implications sank in, Thalenne realized that her choice was no longer between helping strangers and protecting her own people. The giants had just revealed that her people and their people were the same people, bound by her mother's sacrifice and sealed with blood that could not be denied. The decision she had been wrestling with for days was no decision at all. It was a recognition of bonds that already existed, responsibilities that had been hers from the moment her mother's fever broke in a northern tent 15 years ago. She reached out and took the medallion. It was surprisingly warm against her palm, and for just a moment, she could swear she heard a mother's voice whispering words of encouragement and love. The correspondence from other kingdoms arrived like a cascade of rejection, each letter more dismissive than the last. Thalenne sat in her study, surrounded by scrolls bearing the seals of 17 different rulers, and felt the weight of the world's indifference settling on her shoulders. King Marcus of Velthera had been blunt. The northern wastes have always been prone to tribal conflicts. Aramoor would be wise not to meddle in barbarian disputes. Queen Liana of the Sunset Isles had been more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "While we sympathize with your concerns, the islands have no interest in mainland conflicts." Prince Regent Aldrich of Stonehaven had simply returned her message unopened, along with a terse note that Aramoor's sudden concern for foreign affairs was noted but not welcomed. 17 kingdoms, she said to Captain Marduk, who stood reviewing the correspondence with growing dismay. 17 rulers who would rather preserve their comfortable ignorance than face an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps they simply don't believe the threat is real, Marduk suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. Or perhaps they believe exactly what I would have believed a week ago, Thalenne replied. That walls and distance can protect them from any problem, no matter how large. A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the window. 2 riders had arrived, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Even from the tower, Thalenne could see the urgency in their movements as they dismounted and hurried toward the main hall. Minutes later, Garin appeared in the study doorway, his usually composed expression cracked with worry. "Your Highness, we have news from the north. Refugees have reached the Thornwatch border." The Thornwatch was Aramoor's nearest neighbor to the northeast, a mountain kingdom known for its fierce independence and military strength. If refugees were reaching their borders, the darkness was spreading faster than even the giants had predicted. "How many?" she asked. "Thousands, according to the messengers. They speak of entire settlements simply vanishing overnight. The Thornwatch King has declared martial law and closed his borders." Thalenne felt her heart sink. King Roderick of Thornwatch was known as a reasonable man, not given to panic or hasty decisions. If he had closed his borders, he must have seen something that terrified him. "Send word to our guests," she told Marduk. "I need to speak with them immediately." The 3 giants were waiting when she reached the eastern tower, their expressions grim. Magnus held a piece of parchment that hadn't been there during her last visit. "You've heard," Thorvald said without preamble. "Some of it. Refugees at the Thornwatch border, the kingdom sealed. She looked at the parchment in Magnus's hands. What else? Word from our scattered kinsmen, Gunnar replied. The ones who fled. Before the final collapse of the Northern Watch, they report that the darkness has reached the Whispering Woods. Thalenne's blood turned to ice. The Whispering Woods lay only 2 days' hard ride from Thornwatch's northern border. At the Void's current pace, it would reach civilized lands within the week. That's not the worst of it, Magnus said, extending the parchment toward her. Read this. The message was written in the flowing script of the Ice Tribes, but someone had provided a translation in the common tongue. As Thalenne read, her hands began to tremble. The message described refugees fleeing not just from the northern settlements, but from Thornwatch itself. King Roderick's closed borders hadn't been meant to keep refugees out. They had been meant to keep his own people in. The kingdom was collapsing from within as panic spread and order broke down. Civil war, she whispered. Fear is as destructive as the Void itself, Thorin said sadly. It turns neighbor against neighbor, breaks the bonds that hold societies together. By the time the darkness reaches them, they'll already be defeated. Thalenne moved to the window, staring northeast toward the mountains where Thornwatch lay. She had visited there as a child, remembered King Roderick as a kind man who had let her ride his warhorse and had given her a wooden sword carved by his own craftsman. Now his kingdom was tearing itself apart while an ancient evil crept ever closer. The other kingdoms won't listen until it's too late, she said. Not really a question. No, Magnus confirmed. They'll wait until the darkness is at their own borders. And by then, each will stand alone against something that grows stronger with every victory. Unless someone acts now, Thorvin said. Unless someone has the courage to do what needs to be done, regardless of what others think. Thalenne turned back to face them. What exactly are you suggesting? Open your gates, Gunnar said simply. Not just to us, but to all who flee the darkness. Become the refuge that other kingdoms refuse to be. The suggestion was audacious beyond measure. Aramoor had built its prosperity on controlled trade and careful isolation. Opening their gates to mass refugees would strain resources, complicate politics, and potentially invite the very chaos that their policies had been designed to prevent. My council will never agree, she said. Then don't ask them to agree, Magnus replied. Command them to obey. It's not that simple. Aramoor may be a kingdom, but it's also a community. I can't simply ignore the will of the people. Then change their will, Thorvin suggested. Show them what we've shown you. Make them understand what's coming. Over the next hour, they developed a plan that was both desperate and audacious. Rather than trying to convince distant kingdoms through letters and messengers, they would bring the evidence directly to Aramoor. Refugees would be welcomed not as a burden to be endured, but as witnesses to be heard. The giants would share their knowledge openly, letting the people see for themselves the maps and testimonies that painted the scope of the threat. It's a risk, Thalenne admitted. If the people panic like they did in Thornwatch, then we guide their fear toward productive action instead of destructive paralysis, Magnus said. Fear can destroy, but it can also unite. The choice is in how it's channeled. That evening, Thalenne stood before her court once again. This time, however, she had invited not just the nobles and merchants, but representatives from every level of society. Craftsmen and farmers, guards and servants, ship captains and harbor workers, all gathered to hear what their princes had to say. I have news from the north, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. And I have a decision to announce that will affect every person in this kingdom. She gestured to the giants, who had been given places of honor near the throne. These warriors have brought us warning of a threat unlike any our kingdoms have faced. An ancient evil that has already consumed 5 northern realms and moved south toward us. The murmur that ran through the crowd was nervous, but not panicked. These were people who had lived their entire lives in safety, who had never faced existential threats. Tomorrow, the gates of Aramoor will open for the first time in a generation. Not for trade, not for diplomacy, but for refuge. We will welcome all who flee the darkness, and we will prepare to stand with them against what comes. Now the murmur became an uproar. Voices of protest and support mingled in cacophony, but Thalenne raised her hand for silence. I know this goes against our traditions. I know it challenges everything we've been taught about safety and prosperity. But I've learned something in recent days about the difference between isolation and protection. She looked out over the crowd, meeting as many eyes as she could. Isolation is building walls and hoping threats pass you by. Protection is building alliances and ensuring threats never reach the innocent. My mother understood this. She built bridges of kindness that became bridges of strength when we needed them most. The resistance was immediate and vocal. Several merchants demanded to know how the kingdom would feed sudden masses of refugees. Nobles questioned whether opening their gates would invite invasion rather than prevent it. Even some of the common folk expressed worry about their jobs and homes, being threatened by desperate strangers. But there were other voices too. Captain Mardek spoke of honor and duty. Young Mira talked about her brother's reports from the harbor guard. Older servants shared memories of Queen Isabel's quiet generosity and the prosperity it had somehow created. The debate raged for hours, but in the end, it was not the logic of the arguments that swayed the crowd. It was the arrival of the first refugees just after midnight. A handful of survivors from a Thornwatch border village who had fled on foot through mountain passes, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and horror stories that matched. Every word the giants had spoken died, as Thalenne listened to their accounts of neighbors simply vanishing, of darkness that moved like living shadow and consumed everything it touched. She realized that the time for debate had passed. The threat was real. It was coming, and Aramoor would either stand against it with allies or fall to it alone. The choice, when viewed in that light, was no choice at all. The blood oath medallion felt heavier in Thalenne's hands than its size, suggested as if the weight of history and responsibility had been forged into its dark metal. She stood in the center of her private chambers, surrounded by the evidence of her mother's secret life ledgers, correspondence, maps that showed a world far more connected than she had ever imagined. But it was the final discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a false panel in her mother's jewelry box was a letter bearing Thalenne's own name, written in her mother's careful script. The parchment was aged but well preserved, sealed with wax that bore the impression of both the royal seal of Aramoor and something else. The same twisted runes that marked the giant's weapons and the ancient map dot with trembling fingers. Thalenne broke the seal and unfolded the letter. My dearest daughter, it began. If you are reading this, then the darkness has stirred and the time of testing has come. By now you will have met Thalenne and his oath brothers, and you will have learned truths about your inheritance that I could never safely tell you while I lived. Thalenne sank into her mother's chair, her heart pounding as she continued reading. What I am about to tell you will shake the foundations of everything you believe about our kingdom and our family. Your father, may his soul find peace, thought. He was protecting you by keeping these secrets buried. I pray he was wrong, and that the strength I see in you will prove equal to the burden you must now carry. The letter went on to reveal the impossible. Queen Isabel had not just helped the ice tribes once, during the Red Fever epidemic. She had been working with them for years, part of a secret alliance that stretched across the known world. The Northern Watch that the giants spoke of was not just a collection of barbarian sentries. It was the remnant of an ancient organization dedicated to monitoring and containing threats that no single kingdom could face alone. The void that hungers has stirred before, the letter explained. 3 times in recorded history, and each time it was only defeated through the cooperation of all free peoples. The first alliance, the second compact, the third concordat. Each time, representatives of every kingdom had to set aside their differences and work as one. Thalenne's hand shook as she read further. Her mother had not just been a queen who helped strangers out of kindness. She had been a founding member of what was supposed to become the Fourth Alliance, working in secret to build the networks and relationships that would be necessary when the time came. But the southern kingdoms grew comfortable in their prosperity. The letter continued. They forgot the old threats, dismissed the old warnings. Your father, influenced by advisors who value gold over wisdom, withdrew Aramoor from the alliance in the year before your birth. He thought he was protecting our kingdom from entanglements that would drain our resources and invite our enemies' attention. The implications crashed over Thalenne like icy waves. Her kingdom's isolation had not been a source of strength. It had been a betrayal of ancient responsibilities, a breaking of oaths that had kept the world safe for generations. I have spent the last 15 years trying to repair the damage, her mother's letter explained. Working in secret to maintain the relationships your father severed, keeping alive the knowledge and alliances that will be necessary when the darkness returns. The giants who come to you are more than refugees or allies. They are the keepers of that ancient compact, and they have the right to expect Aramoor's aid not as charity, but as the fulfillment of oaths sworn centuries ago. The letter's final paragraphs were the most difficult to read. The choice before you is not between helping strangers and protecting your own people. It is between honoring the commitments that have kept the world safe for 1,000 years, or allowing those commitments to die with the civilizations they were meant to protect. The blood oath medallion that Thorvin carries is not just a symbol of gratitude, it is a key, one of 7 that must be brought together if the Fourth Alliance is to be completed. Thalenne looked up from the letter to stare at the medallion. Resting on her desk, a key, one of 7. The magnitude of what her mother had been involved in, what she was now expected to continue, was staggering. I cannot tell you what choice to make, the letter continued. That burden must be yours, alone. But I can tell you this, your father's path, the path of isolation and self-protection, leads only to destruction. Not just for Aramoor, but for all the kingdoms that might have stood together against the darkness. The only hope lies in the harder path, the one that requires you to trust strangers, risk everything you have built, and place the good of all peoples above the narrow interests of one kingdom. The letter was signed with her mother's name, but below the signature was something else, a map reference that corresponded to a location Thalenne had never heard of, the Sanctuary of Echoes. A knock at the chamber door interrupted her reading. Your Highness? It was Captain Mardek's voice. The giants request an urgent audience. They say news has arrived from the south. Thalenne quickly folded the letter and secured it in her bodice. Whatever news the giants carried, she suspected, it would force her to make the choice her mother had written about sooner than she had hoped. She found the 3 warriors in the Great Hall, but they were not alone. With them stood 2 new figures, women wearing the distinctive blue robes of the Seawalker clans from the distant southern archipelagos. Their presence in Aramoor was impossible under normal circumstances, but these were clearly not normal circumstances. Princess Thalenne, Thorvin said formally, may I present Keepers Nerida and Coral of the Southern Reach. They bring word from the oceanic kingdoms. The taller of the 2 women stepped forward. Her skin was bronzed by sun and salt, her hair woven with shells and silver. When she spoke, her voice carried the rhythm of waves against stone. Your Highness, we come bearing grave tidings. The island kingdom of Merthoa has fallen to the void. Not conquered, not destroyed, consumed utterly. Where the greatest library in the southern seas once stood, there is now only empty water. The news hit Thalenne like a physical blow. Thalenne had been mentioned in her mother's letters as one of the founding members of the original alliance. If it had fallen, how is that possible? She asked. Thalenne was on an island, protected by hundreds of miles of open ocean. The void does not respect natural barriers. The second woman, Coral, explained. It spreads through connections, trade routes, bloodlines, shared memories. Thalenne's great library contained knowledge from every kingdom in the world. Those connections became pathways for the darkness to follow. Magnus the Wise nodded grimly. It's worse than we feared. The void is not just consuming territory. It's using the connections between civilizations to spread faster than any physical force could travel. Which means, Thorvin added, that every kingdom that has had contact with the fallen realms is now at risk. Trade routes, diplomatic missions, even letters and messages, all of them potential pathways for the darkness to follow. Thalenne felt the walls of her comfortable world crumbling around her. The isolation that Aramoor had maintained was not just selfish. It might be the only thing that had kept them safe thus far. But that safety was an illusion if the void continued to spread. Eventually, it would consume everything, connected or not. There's more, Narita said, her expression growing even more somber. Before Thalenne fell, their keepers sent out final messages to all the remaining alliance members. 7 kingdoms still hold the ancient keys. 7 kingdoms that might still have the power to forge a new compact and bind the void as their ancestors did. Let me guess, Thalenne said, her hand unconsciously moving to where the medallion rested against her heart. Aramoor is one of those 7. The linchpin, Coral confirmed. Your mother's bloodline carries the strongest connection to the original compact. Without Aramoor's participation, the alliance cannot be completed. The weight of inherited responsibility settled on Thalenne's shoulders like a mantle of lead. She was not just a princess dealing with a crisis in her own kingdom. She was the heir to ancient obligations that stretched back centuries. The keeper of oaths that could determine the fate of all civilization. What would be required? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Everything, Thorvin said simply. Your kingdom's resources, your people's support, your personal commitment to leave Aramoor and seek out the other keyholders. The alliance can only be forged in person, with all 7 representatives present at the Sanctuary of Echoes. There it was, the place mentioned in her mother's letter. Thalenne realized that her mother had not just been preparing her for this choice, but had been pointing her toward the one place where that choice could be fulfilled. And if I refuse? Then the world dies, Magnus said, without drama or exaggeration. Kingdom by kingdom, person by person, memory by memory, until nothing remains but the void and the emptiness it craves. The silence that followed was broken by voices from the courtyard outside. Thalenne moved to the window and saw what would seal her decision. Hundreds of refugees streaming through Aramoor's gates, carrying children and bundles of possessions, their faces marked by loss and terror and desperate hope. Among them, she spotted familiar faces, servants from the Thornwatch court, merchants she had met at trade negotiations, even a few nobles whose kingdoms had already begun to fall apart under the pressure of approaching darkness. These were not faceless masses seeking charity. They were individuals whose lives had been shattered by forces beyond their control. People who had placed their trust in leaders who had ultimately failed them. She would not be one of those leaders. I accept, she said, turning back to face the assembled group. I will do what my mother would have done. I will honor the ancient compact and seek out the other keyholders. The relief on the giants' faces was palpable, but Thalenne was not finished. But I will not abandon my people to do it. If Aramoor is to be part of this alliance, then all of Aramoor must benefit from its protection. We open our gates, we share our resources, and we prepare for war, not just against the void, but against the fear and despair that are its greatest weapons. As if summoned by her words, Chief Advisor Goran entered the hall, his face pale with panic. "Your Highness," he gasped, urgent word from our southern borders. "King Edmund of Lysander has declared war on all kingdoms harboring northern refugees. His armies march toward our borders as we speak." The new crisis hit like a thunderbolt, but Thalenne found herself strangely calm. The choice was made, the path was set. Whatever came next, she would meet it not as an isolated princess protecting her narrow interests, but as the heir to an ancient legacy and the bearer of responsibilities that transcended any single kingdom's concerns. The real test was about to begin. The war horn of Aramoor had not sounded in living memory. Forged in the kingdom's earliest days from the tusk of a great sea beast, it hung in the highest tower of the castle, forgotten by most and remembered only in the oldest songs. When Captain Marek climbed the narrow stairs to reach it, his hand shook as he lifted the ancient instrument to his lips. The sound that emerged was not the bright call of modern horns, but something deeper and more primal a voice that seemed to rise from the very stones of the kingdom and echo across the cliffs like the cry of the sea itself. It spoke of danger and defiance, of ancient duties and desperate courage dotted in the great hall below. Princess Thalenne stood before the largest gathering in Aramoor's history. Every citizen who could reach the castle had come, nobles and commoners, merchants and fishermen, refugees and longtime residents. The hall overflowed into the courtyards, and still more people pressed close to hear what their princess would say. "People of Aramoor," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the assembled crowd. "Citizens and guests, friends and strangers, who have found sanctuary within our walls, we stand at a crossroads that will define not just our kingdom, but the fate of all civilization." The crowd was silent, though Thalenne could feel the tension radiating from hundreds of souls pressed together in desperate hope and growing fear. "King Edmund of Lysander marched against us with an army of 10,000 men. He claims we have violated ancient treaties by harboring refugees from the northern territories. He demands we close our gates and turn away all who seek sanctuary." A murmur ran through the crowd, part anger, part fear, part defiance. These people had lived their entire lives in peace, but they were not cowards. They were the descendants of the warriors who had carved a kingdom from clifftop stone, the children of builders who had raised walls that had never fallen. "I will not close our gates," Thalenne declared, her voice rising above the murmur. "I will not turn away those who flee from horrors beyond imagining. I will not choose the false safety of isolation over the true strength that comes from standing together." The cheer that arose was spontaneous and thunderous, but Thalenne raised her hand for quiet. She was not finished. "But I will not lie to you about the cost. King Edmund's army is larger than ours. His cavalry is renowned throughout the southern kingdoms. If we stand against him, some of us will not survive to see the dawn of peace." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. These were people who had never faced war, but they were not naive about its consequences. "I ask you now to choose," Thalenne continued. "Not as your princess commanding obedience, but as one person speaking to others. Will you stand with me? Will you fight not just for Aramoor, but for the principle that no kingdom should stand alone against the darkness that threatens us all?" The response came not from the nobles or the wealthy merchants, but from the refugees themselves. An old man who had fled the collapse of his northern village stepped forward, his voice cracked but strong. "Princess, my granddaughter was dying of hunger when your guards found us on the mountain paths. Your people fed her, clothed her, gave her medicine when she was sick with fever. How can we do less than offer our lives in return?" A woman from the fallen kingdom of Thornwatch raised her voice next. "I was a soldier before I became a refugee. My sword is yours if you'll have it." One by one, voices rose from the crowd. Not just refugees offering to fight for the kingdom that had sheltered them, but Aramoor's own citizens declaring their willingness to defend principles they were only now learning to understand. But it was young Mira who spoke the words that would be remembered in the songs that followed. The servant girl who had found courage in the great hall days before stepped forward again, her voice clear and strong. "Your Highness, my whole life I've served in this castle. I've cleaned your chambers, brought your meals, tended your fires. I never thought my opinion mattered, never thought I had anything important to offer." She paused, looking around at the crowd. "But I know what it feels like to be powerless, to depend on the kindness of others for your very survival. Every refugee who has come through our gates knows that feeling too, and I'd rather die fighting alongside them than live knowing. I turned my back on people who needed help." The roar of approval that followed shook the ancient stones of the castle. In that moment, Thalenne realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, not just the birth of an alliance between kingdoms, but the transformation of her people from isolated observers to active participants in the world's struggles. "Then, we stand together," she declared, her voice ringing with new authority. "Citizens and refugees, soldiers and civilians, all united in defense of something greater than any single kingdom. The principle that compassion is not weakness, and that courage shared is courage multiplied." The preparations that followed transformed Aramoor in ways that months of gradual change could never have accomplished. The giants shared their knowledge of warfare, teaching Aramoor's guards techniques for fighting larger, more experienced armies. The Seawalker women, Nerida and Coral, used their magic to send messages to other alliance members, calling for aid that might or might not arrive in time. But it was the refugees themselves who provided the most valuable resource knowledge of their enemies. Former soldiers from fallen kingdoms described King Edmund's tactics, his strengths and weaknesses. Merchants who had traded with Lysander provided details about supply lines and reinforcement routes. Nobles who had attended Edmund's court shared insights into his character and motivations. "He's not evil," explained Lord Garrett, a refugee from a border kingdom that had already submitted to Edmund's rule. "He genuinely believes he's protecting civilization by maintaining order and traditional boundaries. But his fear of change has made him blind to the greater threat." Thalenne found this knowledge both comforting and troubling. An evil enemy could be fought with clear conscience, but a misguided one presented moral complexities that had no easy answers. 3 days before Edmund's army was expected to reach their borders, a messenger arrived under a flag of truce. The young man bore Edmund's personal seal and a formal demand for Thalenne's surrender. "His Majesty King Edmund offers generous terms," the messenger announced to the assembled court. "Surrender the northern refugees for relocation to designated camps, close your borders to future asylum seekers, and Aramoor will be permitted to continue as a tributary kingdom under Lysander's protection." "And if we refuse?" Thalenne asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then His Majesty will be forced to treat Aramoor as a rebellious territory in need of military correction." The threat was clear, but so was the choice. Thalenne looked around. The hall at the faces watching her nobles and commoners, citizens and refugees, all waiting to see if their princess would trade their principles for their safety. "Tell King Edmund," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "that Princess Thalenne of Aramoor declines his generous offer. Tell him that we will not trade the freedom of the innocent for the illusion of security. And tell him that if he wishes to test the strength of our walls, he's welcome to try." The messenger's face paled, but he nodded formally. "I will carry your words to His Majesty." After he left, the hall erupted in nervous conversation. Some voices expressed now 10,000 soldiers was an overwhelming force for a kingdom that had never maintained a large army. Others spoke with defiant confidence. Their walls were strong, their cause was just, and they had allies with knowledge and skills that Edmund couldn't match. But it was Thalenne who provided the perspective that mattered most. The giant warrior approached the throne, his massive frame somehow conveying both strength and humility. "Princess," he said, his voice pitched so only she could hear, "you know this battle is not really about refugees or territory." "I know," she replied quietly. "It's about whether the kingdoms will unite against the true threat or exhaust themselves fighting each other while the void grows stronger." Edmund doesn't understand what's coming. To him, the Northern crisis is just another tribal conflict. The refugees just another political problem to be managed. He sees your compassion as weakness because he's never faced something that requires strength beyond military force. Thalenne nodded, understanding the deeper implications. This battle would determine not just Aramoor's fate, but whether the fragile alliance she was trying to build would survive its first real test. "What do our scouts report?" she asked Captain Marduk, who had been coordinating the kingdom's defenses. "Edmund's army will reach our southern border tomorrow at dawn. They're traveling with siege engines, catapults, battering rams, scaling towers. They're prepared for a long campaign." "And our strength?" 3,000 able-bodied defenders, including the refugees who have military experience. The giants have agreed to fight alongside us, which effectively doubles our combat effectiveness. The Seawalker women can provide magical support, though they warn that their power is limited this far from the ocean. The numbers were not encouraging, but Thalenne had learned that numbers alone did not determine the outcome of conflicts. Motivation mattered, unity mattered, and most importantly, the righteousness of the cause mattered. Not because gods intervened in human affairs, but because people fought harder for principles they believed in than for leaders they merely obeyed. That night, she walked the walls of her kingdom, looking out over the lands that would soon echo with the sounds of battle. The refugees had not been idle. They had worked alongside Aramoor's citizens to strengthen defenses, dig trenches, and prepare for siege. Children too young to fight had helped carry supplies. Elderly people too frail for combat had shared knowledge and provided encouragement. This was what her mother had envisioned, not just a kingdom, but a community bound together by shared values rather than shared blood. It was what the ancient alliance had been built on, and what would need to be rebuilt if the world was to survive the darkness that approached from the north as dawn approached. Thalenne stood on the highest tower of her castle, watching the southern horizon for the first signs of Edmund's army. The war horn rested beside her, ready to sound again when the time came to choose between surrender and sacrifice. She thought of her mother's letter, of ancient oaths and broken compacts, of the other key holders scattered across the known world, who might even now be facing similar choices. The battle that was about to begin would echo far beyond Aramoor's borders, rippling through the network of relationships and rivalries that connected all the kingdoms of men. Win or lose, the old world of isolation and indifference was ending. What would replace it remained to be seen, but Thalenne was determined that whatever emerged would be worthy of the sacrifices about to be made in its name. The first glint of armor appeared on the southern road, and Princess Thalenne reached for the war horn, knowing that when its voice rang out across the cliffs, it would be calling her people not just to battle, but to transformation. The crown of compassion had been crafted for Thalenne's coronation 8 years ago, its golden circlet inlaid with sapphires the color of deep ocean water. She had worn it on ceremonial occasions, viewing it as a symbol of inherited privilege and authority. Now, as she placed it on her head before descending to meet King Edmund's army, she understood it meant something entirely different. It was not a symbol of power over others, but of responsibility to them. Not a mark of separation from her people, but of unity with their struggles and hopes. The gates of Aramoor stood open as they had for days. But now they framed something unprecedented. Princess Thalenne walking out to meet an enemy army, alone. Except for the 3 giants who flanked her like living monuments to an older, more honorable way of war. King Edmund's forces spread across the valley below like a dark tide. 10,000 men in ordered ranks, their armor gleaming in the morning sun, their banners snapping in the sea wind. At their head rode Edmund himself, a man of middle years whose reputation for military prowess was matched only by his certainty that order must be preserved at any cost. Thalenne descended the steep path that led from her castle gates to the valley floor, each step taking her further from the safety of her walls and closer to a confrontation that would determine not just her kingdom's fate, but the future of all the alliances her mother had died trying to preserve. "Your Majesty," she called out when she was within speaking distance of Edmund's position. "I am Princess Thalenne of Aramoor. I come to speak with you under the ancient laws of parley." Edmund spurred his horse forward, flanked by his knights and advisors. Up close, he was exactly what she had expected, a man of military bearing whose every gesture spoke of absolute confidence in his own righteousness. "Princess," he replied, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, "I had hoped you would see reason and accept my generous terms. Instead, I find you standing with northern savages and preparing to defend harbored criminals." "I see no criminals here," Thalenne replied steadily. "Only refugees fleeing from horrors that you refuse to acknowledge." Edmund's expression hardened. "I acknowledge the threat of chaos, Princess. The threat of kingdoms abandoning their responsibilities to chase after imaginary dangers while real enemies gather strength." He gestured toward the giants. "These barbarians have filled your head with tales of ancient evils and mystical alliances, but I deal in facts, not fairy stories." "Then let me give you facts," Thorvin rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. "The kingdom of Myrtala has fallen completely, not conquered, but consumed. The Whispering Woods, where your own merchants once traded, are now empty wasteland where nothing grows and no animals venture. 5 northern realms have simply vanished, their people, their cities, their very stones gone as if they never existed. Northern tribal conflicts." Edmund dismissed, exaggerated by desperate people seeking shelter at others' expense. Magnus stepped forward, his ancient eyes fixed on the king. "Your Majesty, I am old enough to remember the last time the void stirred, 70 years ago. It was contained then only because all the kingdoms worked together, setting aside their quarrels to face a common threat. If you continue this path of isolation and suspicion, enough." Edmund's voice cracked like a whip. "I will not be lectured by foreign barbarians about the governance of civilized lands." He turned back to Thalenne. "Princess, you have one final chance. Surrender the refugees, close your gates, and return to the proper order of things. Refuse, and I will take your kingdom by force and install a ruler who understands duty to his own people." The words hung in the air between them, final and irrevocable. Around them, 10,000 soldiers waited for orders, while on the cliff tops above, 3,000 defenders prepared for the fight of their lives. "I refuse," Thalenne sighed, her voice clear and unwavering. "I will not trade the innocent for the illusion of safety. I will not close my heart to suffering because it comes from beyond my borders. And I will not abandon the principles my mother died protecting." Edmund's face flushed with anger. "Then you choose to see your kingdom burn for the sake of foreign strangers. I choose to see it transformed," she replied. From a fortress of selfishness into a beacon of hope, the king wheeled his horse around, spurring back toward his army. "So be it. Herald, sound the advance." Let it be recorded that Princess Thalenne of Aramoor chose destruction over wisdom, as the war horns of Lysander echoed across the valley. Thalenne felt a strange calm settle over her. The choice was made, the die cast. Whatever happened now, she would meet it as her mother's daughter, standing for principles that transcended the narrow interests of any single kingdom. "Princess," Gunnar said quietly, "you should return to the castle. Let us handle what comes next." "No," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "If my people are to fight for me, then I will fight alongside them." The battle began with the methodical advance of Edmund's infantry, their shields locked together in formations that had conquered a dozen kingdoms. Behind them came the cavalry, resplendent in mail and silk, their lances bright in the morning sun. And behind them, the siege engines that would reduce Aramoor's ancient walls to rubble. But the defenders were ready. The refugees who had seemed like helpless victims days ago now revealed themselves as hardened veterans with knowledge hard won from the conflicts that had driven them from their homes. They had turned Aramoor's clifftop position into a maze of defensive positions, each one designed to channel attacking forces into carefully prepared killing grounds. The first clash came as Edmund's advance guard reached the outer defenses. What should have been a quick breakthrough became a grinding battle of attrition as refugees, who had lost everything, fought with the desperation of people who had nowhere left to run. Thalenne found herself in the thick of the fighting, her ceremonial sword replaced by practical steel, her royal gown exchanged for mail and leather. She had never fought in real combat before, but desperation and determination proved effective teachers. Around her, she saw miracles of courage and sacrifice. Mira, the servant girl, stood shoulder to shoulder with a giant warrior twice her size, both of them protecting a group of refugee children who had been caught in the open when the attack began. Captain Marduk led a charge of mixed forces Aramoor guards, fighting alongside former soldiers from a dozen different kingdoms, united by shared purpose rather than shared blood. But it was the presence of the giants that truly turned the tide of the first engagement. Thorvin, Magnus, and Gunnar moved through Edmund's ranks like forces of nature, their ice-forged weapons cutting through steel as if it were cloth. They fought not with the wild fury of barbarians, but with the disciplined precision of warriors who had spent their lives protecting others. The sight of his advance guard being repelled by what he had dismissed as northern savages sent Edmund into a rage that clouded his military judgment. Instead of consolidating his position and preparing for a siege, he ordered immediate assault after immediate assault, each one bloodier and less successful than the last. "He's fighting angry," Magnus observed during a brief lull in the battle. "Anger makes warriors predictable." Thalenne nodded, wiping blood from a cut on her cheek. Around them, the combined forces of Aramoor and the refugees held their defensive positions, but she could see the cost in the faces of her people. They were holding, but barely. "Can we win?" she asked. "That depends," Thorvin replied, "on what you mean by winning." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of horns echoed across the battlefield, not Edmund's war horns, but something different. Something that made the giants straighten with recognition and hope. "Reinforcements?" Thalenne asked. Magnus smiled grimly. "Better. Allies." The healing waters of Aramoor had always been considered one of the kingdom's lesser treasures natural. Springs that bubbled up from deep within the cliffs, their mineral-rich flow believed to have restorative properties. They had been reserved for the royal family and their guests, a luxury that few citizens had ever experienced. Now, as Thalenne knelt beside the springs, washing blood from her hands and tending to wounded defenders, she understood why her mother had insisted on opening them to anyone in need. Water that healed was not meant to be hoarded, any more than wisdom or compassion should be kept for the exclusive use of the privileged. The reinforcements that had arrived were not armies, but something far more valuable, representatives of the other alliance kingdoms, each bearing one of the 7 keys needed to forge the compact that might yet save the world from the approaching void. Lady Morwen of the Eastern Reaches had come with 50 of her finest archers, but more importantly, she carried the crystal, of binding a gem that pulsed with inner light and sang with harmonies that seemed to resonate with the medallion at Thallenne's throat. Lord Commander Thalenne of the Iron Hills had brought only a dozen knights, but they were veterans of the deepest battles, and he bore the forge heart, a weapon that blazed with silver fire. Each new arrival changed the character of the battle. These were not just reinforcements, but proof that the old alliances could be rebuilt, that kingdoms could set aside their differences when faced with threats that transcended any single nation's concerns. King Edmund's reaction to the new arrivals was swift and predictable. Instead of recognizing that he faced something larger than a local rebellion, he doubled down on his conviction that force could solve any problem. Foreign interference, he declared to his assembled commanders. This confirms what I've said all along. Aramoor has become a haven for those who would destabilize the natural order of things. But his soldiers were beginning to show signs of doubt. They had expected to crush a small kingdom's defenses in a matter of hours. Instead, they found themselves locked in brutal combat with an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each engagement. Reinforced by warriors whose skills and equipment were unlike anything they had encountered. The turning point came when Nerida and Coral, the Seawalker women, finally received word from their oceanic allies. Ships appeared on the horizon, not warships, but vessels carrying the most precious cargo imaginable. More refugees, but also more keyholders, more representatives of the ancient compact that had once held the world together. 7 keys, Magnus whispered, his ancient eyes bright with something that might have been hope. For the first time in generations, all 7 keys are in one place. Thalenne looked around at the assembled representatives, warriors, and scholars. Nobles and commoners, all united by the bonds her mother had spent years carefully constructing. They came from kingdoms that had been enemies, traditions that had been rivals, but they shared something more important than any old grievance: the understanding that some threats were too large for any single people to face alone. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Thorvin replied. "You choose between fighting a battle or winning a war." The choice he referred to was not military but moral. She could continue the defense of Aramoor, perhaps even drive Edmund's army back and claim victory in this single engagement. Or she could use this moment, this gathering of the keys, this proof that the alliance could be rebuilt to achieve something far greater. Standing in the healing waters, surrounded by wounded defenders and exhausted refugees, Thalenne made her decision. "Call for parley," she commanded. One final time, Captain Marduk looked uncertain. "Your Highness, we have the advantage now. Edmund's forces are exhausted, his siege engines damaged. We could press the attack and prove that we're no different from him," she interrupted. "That we respond to fear with violence and meet force with greater force." She looked around at the assembled keyholders. "We have something more powerful than any army. We have the chance to show him what unity looks like." The second parley took place not in the valley below, but on the ancient ceremonial ground that lay midway between Aramoor's gates and Edmund's battle lines. It was a place where, according to legend, the first kings of the region had met to establish the boundaries and laws that had kept peace for centuries. Edmund arrived with a smaller retinue this time, his armor dented and his expression grim. The day's fighting had not gone as he had planned, and the arrival of foreign reinforcements had complicated what should have been a simple military operation. "Princess," he said formally, "I assume you wish to discuss terms of surrender." "I wish to discuss terms of alliance," she replied, gesturing to the keyholders who stood arranged in a circle around the ceremonial space. "Your Majesty, meet the representatives of the Fourth Alliance, the compact that your own kingdom was invited to join, before pride and fear made that impossible." Edmund's eyes moved from face to face, taking in the diversity of the group. Warriors, from the ice tribes stood beside scholars from the desert kingdoms. Sea folk who had never walked on dry land shared space with mountain dwellers who had never seen the ocean. Each bore symbols of ancient authority, keys that hummed with power that predated any of the modern kingdoms. "Your Majesty," Lady Morwen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never learned to doubt her own worth. "We gather not to threaten your kingdom, but to save it. The void that hungers spreads faster than any army can march. Within days, it will reach the southern borders of your own realm." "Impossible," Edmund replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Lord Commander Valance stepped forward, his silver-fired weapon pulsing with each heartbeat. "I have seen the reports from our border scouts, Your Majesty. Entire villages simply gone, their inhabitants vanished without trace. This is not conquest, it is annihilation." "Even if that were true," Edmund said slowly, "what would you have me do? Abandon my responsibilities to my own people to chase after ancient legends?" "Join us," Thalenne said simply. "Not as a subordinate or vassal, but as an equal partner in something larger than any single kingdom. Help us forge the compact that will bind the void as our ancestors did. And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Around them, the assembled forces of both armies waited for words that would determine whether the ancient ceremonial ground would see the renewal of old alliances or witness the final breakdown of civilized discourse. "Then you fight the void alone," Magnus said quietly, "as 17 other kingdoms have tried to do. And like them, you will discover that isolation is not strength, it is the guarantee of defeat." For the first time since the confrontation began, King Edmund looked uncertain. The absolute confidence that had driven him to this point was cracking as he faced the possibility that his worldview might be fundamentally flawed. What would this alliance require? He asked finally. "Everything," Thalenne replied honestly. "Your kingdom's resources, your people's courage, your personal commitment to set aside old grievances for the sake of survival. It means accepting that the refugees you came here to remove are not your enemies, but your allies in a fight that will determine the fate of all civilization." The silence that followed was broken by a sound that chilled every heart present. Low, harmonious wail that seemed to come from the very air itself. It was the sound of the void feeding, the death cry of another kingdom consumed by the approaching darkness. "The Sunset Isles," Coral whispered, her seafolk senses more attuned to distant disasters than those of land dwellers. "They have fallen." The news hit like a physical blow. The Sunset Isles had been one of the richest and most defensible kingdoms in the known world, protected by miles of ocean and defended by the finest navy ever assembled. If they could fall to the void, then no kingdom was truly safe. King Edmund's face went pale as the implications sank in. His own realm lay directly in the path of the spreading darkness, and his army was already committed to a battle that had nothing to do with the real threat. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Days," Thorvin replied. "Perhaps hours, if the void has learned to move through the connections between kingdoms as our allies fear." The king looked around at his assembled forces, then at the representatives of the alliance, then finally at Princess Thalenne. In that moment, she saw him truly understand the choice before him, not between victory and defeat in a local conflict, but between unity and annihilation on a scale that transcended all earthly concerns. "Tell me," he said finally, "what must be done?" The new banner that flew from Aramoor's highest tower bore symbols that had never been seen together in the history of the known world. The golden cliffs of Aramoor intertwined with the ice blue runes of the northern tribes, the silver stars of the eastern reaches woven alongside the coral patterns of the Seawalker clans. It was not the flag of any single kingdom, but the emblem of the Fourth Alliance, a compact forged not in the comfortable halls of diplomacy, but in the desperate crucible of approaching annihilation. 6 months had passed since the sanctuary of echoes had witnessed the binding of the void, and the world was still learning what it meant to live in the aftermath of near extinction. The great darkness had been contained, pushed back into the spaces between spaces where it could hunger harmlessly for another age. But the cost had been immense. Entire kingdoms had been erased from existence, their people and histories consumed, so completely that only the Alliance members retained any memory of their existence. Princess Thalenne stood at her window, watching ships arrive in the harbor below, not the careful, controlled trade vessels of the old days, but a constant stream of vessels carrying refugees, supplies, knowledge, and hope from across the known world. Aramoor had become what her mother had always envisioned, not just a kingdom, but a nexus where all peoples could gather in safety and mutual support. "Your Highness," came Captain Mardek's familiar voice from behind her. "The morning reports." She turned, noting the changes that the months had wrought in him. He wore new insignia now, not just captain of Aramoor's guard, but marshal of the Alliance forces. The responsibility had aged him, but also given him a purpose that went beyond mere soldiering. "How many arrived yesterday?" she asked. 347 refugees from the remnants of the Thornwatch Kingdom. 2 diplomatic missions from southern realms seeking to join the Alliance, and a trade delegation from the Crystal Caverns bearing gifts for the princess who opened her gates when others closed theirs. Thalenne nodded, but her attention was drawn to a particular ship mooring at the harbor's edge. Its sails bore the ice-blue runes she had learned to read during the months of preparation for the Great Binding, and she recognized the massive figure standing at its prow. "Thorvund has returned," she said. "Yes, Your Highness. He brings word from the northern reconstruction efforts. Shall I have him attend you here?" "No," she replied, already moving toward the door. "I'll meet him at the harbor. Some conversations are too important for throne rooms." The walk through Aramoor's transformed streets was a daily reminder of how much had changed. Where once only citizens of the kingdom had walked these cobblestones, now one could hear a dozen languages in any market square. Refugees had not remained refugees. They had become farmers, craftsmen, teachers, guards. Their knowledge and skills had enriched Aramoor beyond measure, proving her mother's old saying that wealth shared was wealth multiplied. She passed the Memorial Plaza, where names were carved in stone, all those who had fallen during the dark. Months when the void had seemed unstoppable. King Edmund's name was there, among the honored dead. He had redeemed his early mistakes by leading the final charge. That had bought time for the Alliance to complete their binding ritual. His sacrifice had saved not just his own kingdom, but all the kingdoms of men at the harbor. Thorvund was supervising the unloading of supplies, food, and medicine for the newest refugees, but also books and artifacts salvaged from the ruins of Urvea. Fallen realms. The giant warrior looked older than when she had first met him, his hair more white than silver, but his eyes held a peace that had been absent during those desperate early days. "Princess," he said, offering the slight bow that had become their customary greeting, "I bring good news from the north. The settlements are thriving beyond our best hopes. The survivors of the ice tribes have united as never before, and they're joined by refugees from a dozen different kingdoms. What's growing there isn't just a collection of settlements, it's a new way of living, where ancient enemies work side by side because they've learned that cooperation is the only path to survival." They walked together along the harbor's edge, past ships that bore the flags of realms that had once been considered enemies. The Alliance had not just defeated the void, it had created something unprecedented in the history of civilization. A network of kingdoms bound not by conquest or treaty, but by shared experience and mutual aid. "Any word from the other key holders?" Thalenne asked. "Lady Morwen sends word from the eastern reaches that they've established 3 new cities for displaced peoples. Lord Commander Valen reports that the Iron Hills are producing more food than ever. now that they're using agricultural techniques shared by refugees from farming kingdoms. And the Seawalker clans have opened trade routes that connect realms that had never even known of each other's existence. It was exactly what a mother had dreamed of, a world where the artificial barriers between peoples gave way to natural connections based on shared humanity. The alliance had not just been a military necessity. It had become a model for how civilization could organize itself around cooperation rather than competition. "There's something else," Thorvin said, his tone growing more serious. "We've detected signs that other voids exist, sleeping still, but present. The binding we achieved was specific to the one that had awakened. There may be others in distant corners of the world that will require similar cooperation to contain." The news should have been frightening, but Thalenne found herself oddly comforted by it. The old world, where each kingdom stood alone against whatever threats emerged, was gone forever. In its place was something far more resilient, a network of alliances and friendships that could adapt to meet any challenge. "Then we'll be ready," she said simply. "All of us, together." As they stood watching the sunset paint the harbor waters, gold and crimson, Thalenne reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with 3 wounded giants asking for simple shelter, and it had led to the transformation of not just Aramoor, but the entire known world. Her mother's legacy lived on, not in the hidden chambers and secret charity of the old days, but in the open gates and shared prosperity of the Alliance. The medallion that had once been a symbol of blood, that had become something far greater, a reminder that the bonds between peoples were stronger than the barriers that seemed to divide them. Young Mira approached, no longer a servant, but the newly appointed Minister of Refugee Affairs, her former timidity replaced by the confidence that came from discovering her own worth. "Your Highness, the Evening Council is ready to convene. We have representatives from 6 new kingdoms seeking alliance membership." 6 more, Thalenne mused. "Soon, there won't be any kingdoms left outside the alliance." "Would that be such a bad thing?" Thorvin asked with a smile. She considered the question seriously. A world where all peoples worked together, where resources were shared according to need rather than hoarded according to fear, where the ancient cycle of war and conquest was replaced by cooperation and mutual aid. It sounded like the fairy tales her mother had told her as a child, but then her mother's fairy tales had proven to be more real than the harsh pragmatism her father had taught her. Perhaps the greatest stories were not fantasies to be dismissed, but possibilities waiting to be realized by people brave enough to believe in them. "No," she said finally. "It wouldn't be a bad thing at all." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, their light reflected not just in the harbor waters, but in the windows of homes that shelter people from every corner of the known world. Princess Thalenne understood that this was how lasting change occurred, not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through the daily choice to open one's heart to others, to see strangers as neighbors, and to remember that true strength came not from standing alone, but from standing together. The gates of Aramoor would remain open, and the banner of the Alliance would fly high, a symbol of hope for all who still wandered the world seeking sanctuary. And in the years to come, when children asked their grandparents about the time when kingdoms stood apart and the darkness nearly consumed all, the elders would tell them about the princes who chose compassion over fear, about the giants who kept their ancient oath, and about the day when 3 simple words, "Don't turn us away," changed the world forever. For in the end, it had not been armies or magic or ancient powers that had saved civilization. It had been the recognition that no one should face the darkness alone, and that the greatest treasure any kingdom could possess was not gold or territory, but the trust and friendship of those who had once been strangers. The alliance would endure, its banner flying from 1,000 towers, its principles carried in 1,000,000 hearts. And whenever the darkness stirred again, for it surely would, In some distant age, there would be people ready to stand together, to offer shelter to the desperate, and to remember that the strongest walls were not those that kept others out, but those built from the bonds that brought them in. In her mother's hidden chambers, now transformed into a library accessible to all, scholars from every kingdom worked to preserve the knowledge that had nearly been lost. The ledgers that had once recorded secret charity now served as models for open cooperation. The maps that had shown a world divided were being redrawn to show a world united. And in the great hall where Thalenne had first heard those desperate words from the giants, children from a dozen different peoples played together, their laughter echoing off stones that had once witnessed only the cold protocols of isolation. They spoke each other's languages, shared each other's games, and grew up understanding that the world was large enough for everyone, if only people were brave enough to make room. This was the true victory, not the defeat of any single enemy, but the building of something better than what had come before. The Fourth Alliance would face new challenges, encounter new threats, make new mistakes, but it would face them together, as one people divided by neither walls nor fear, united by the simple understanding that everyone deserved a place to call home and someone willing to say, "You are welcome here." The princess, who had once known only isolation, now stood surrounded by friends from across the world, watching ships bring new hope to her harbor every day. The gates that had once barred all strangers now welcomed all peoples. The kingdom that had once stood alone now anchored an alliance that spanned the known world. And somewhere in the evening wind that carried the scents of spices from distant lands and the songs of children at play, those who listened carefully could hear an echo of Queen Isabel's gentle voice, telling stories of heroes who helped strangers in kingdoms that opened their doors to those in need, stories that were no longer fairy tales, but the living reality of the world her daughter had chosen to create.